Homeless black boy yelled, "Stop! It's poison!" Billionaire froze when he learned the truth. Jamal had always known the streets better than anyone. They were both his home and his prison, a place where survival was the only rule. The tall, gray buildings around him towered over like giants, blocking the sunlight, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. There was no place for a boy like him in the world of suits and luxury. He was a nobody, one of many faces that passed by unnoticed by the people who hurried about their day, never pausing to consider the lives they were walking past. It was the same every day. Jamal would wake up on a park bench, with only a thin, tattered blanket to keep him warm. His stomach rumbled, but there was no food in sight, so he would head out to the nearest alley, hoping to find a half-eaten sandwich or maybe a discarded apple. Sometimes he was lucky, other times not. But every day was the same. He learned to keep his head down, to avoid trouble, and to do what he needed to survive. This particular afternoon felt like any other. The sun was high in the sky, and the city buzzed with the sounds of busy people rushing past. Jamal was walking through a well-known park in the heart of the city. This park was unlike the others. It was manicured, with clean sidewalks and fountains that sparkled in the sunlight. Families often gathered here, and the children played freely, laughing and shouting in the fresh air. Jamal, who had spent so much time on the outskirts of this world, had always felt out of place here. He walked the edges, his eyes darting around, watching as the children played, as their parents chatted and drank expensive coffee, completely unaware of the struggles others faced. As Jamal wandered deeper into the park, something caught his eye. A group of children was gathered near a fountain, playing with balloons. They were laughing, chasing each other around, their bright, colorful balloons dancing in the wind. Jamal's attention was drawn to one of the balloons. It was a deep, strange color, unlike the others. It shimmered under the sunlight, reflecting light in a way that made Jamal's heart race. There was something off about it, but he couldn't quite place what it was. He moved closer, hoping to catch a better look. It wasn't until he heard the voice of a man that he understood why he had been drawn to this moment. The man was standing nearby, talking to a group of well-dressed people. Jamal recognized him instantly. It was Theodore Donovan, a billionaire businessman known for his investments in technology and luxury real estate. He was one of the most powerful men in the city. Theodore's voice was calm and confident as he discussed business with his colleagues, but Jamal didn't care about the conversation. What mattered was the balloon in the hands of one of the children and the container it was tied to. Jamal squinted, his heart pounding. The balloon wasn't just filled with air, it was filled with something else. The child was holding it carelessly, twirling it around without a second thought. But the faint label on the bottle attached to the balloon caught Jamal's attention. It was a chemical container, the kind you would find in warehouses, dangerous and toxic. It was meant to be discarded, not used as a toy. Jamal's stomach churned. He had seen chemicals like that before. It reminded him of the time he lost his sister. He remembered the house, the old bottle of cleaning fluid that had been left out, carelessly unmarked, and how his younger sister had grabbed it, thinking it was something else. She was so young. She didn't know any better, and she paid the price with her life. He had watched her suffer, the poison spreading through her body, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Jamal couldn't just stand there and do nothing. He had to act. Without thinking, he bolted toward the group of children and shouted, "Stop!" "It's poison," his voice cracked as he yelled, desperation lacing every syllable. The words escaped him in a rush, his instincts screaming that he had to stop them. He was too far away to reach the child with the balloon, but his words were loud enough to catch the attention of everyone nearby. People stopped in their tracks. The children froze. Even Theodore, who had been speaking to his colleagues, turned his head toward the boy, confusion spreading across his face. The park fell silent for a moment. The children looked around, unsure of what to do. Some of the parents turned, glancing at Jamal as if he were some nuisance, another homeless person who didn't know any better. The rich people who had been talking to Theodore stared at him, one eyebrow raised in disbelief. They had no idea who he was, and the way he looked ragged, dirty, his clothes torn, made them doubt the seriousness of his warning. But Jamal wasn't looking at them. His eyes were locked on the balloon, still dangling dangerously in the air, ready to pop. He could feel the tension in the air, the heavy silence that hung between him and the others. Theodore Donovan, the man he had never imagined he would meet, was now standing just a few feet away, his gaze fixed on Jamal. For a long, uncomfortable moment, Theodore didn't say anything. His eyes scanned Jamal, taking in the boy's disheveled appearance and then the balloon with the chemical bottle attached to it. The billionaire's face remained calm, but his mind raced. Was it really poison? Jamal's warning sounded like the frantic cry of someone who had seen too much. But Theodore had heard of people making baseless accusations before. He couldn't possibly believe this kid, not without proof. "Get away from here, kid," one of Theodore's associates muttered, dismissing Jamal's warning as just another outburst from a homeless boy. The others nodded in agreement, already turning back to their conversation. They didn't want to be bothered with a child's ranting. But Jamal's instincts screamed louder now. He couldn't just walk away. His sister's memory, the terror he had felt that day, drove him forward. He stepped closer to the child with the balloon and repeated, "It's poison, you don't know what you're playing with." His voice was steady now, the desperation replaced by a deep, gut-wrenching certainty. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, a fear rooted in the loss of a family member. He couldn't let another child go through that, not again. The crowd had started to move again, dismissing him, but Jamal stood his ground. His heart raced, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't know how to explain what he was seeing, but he had to keep going. There was no turning back now. Finally, Theodore, his expression unreadable, glanced at his team. "Check that balloon," he said, his voice low but firm. There was no doubt now. Jamal's warning had hit something inside him. He wasn't just a boy screaming for attention. There was something real here, something worth investigating. Jamal stepped back, his body tense. He didn't know if they would believe him, but all he could do was hope. The air felt thick as Theodore watched his security team rush forward to inspect the balloon. As the seconds passed, Jamal could only wait, the silence of the park pressing in around him. Would they see the truth? Or would they ignore him just like everyone else always had? Jamal stood frozen, his heart racing as the seconds ticked by. He had done all he could, and now it was up to the people around him to take the warning seriously. But deep down, Jamal didn't trust anyone. He had learned long ago that when you were poor, people didn't care about you. You were invisible, nothing more than a shadow passing through their lives. His life had been nothing but a constant struggle. There had been moments when he thought things might get better, but they never did. Life on the streets was unforgiving, and hope often felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. His past was something Jamal rarely spoke about. People like him, homeless kids living on the streets, didn't have time to dwell on the past. They had to focus on surviving day by day, hour by hour. But as he watched the security guards inspect the balloon, Jamal couldn't help but think about his sister. Her name was Mia, and she had been everything to him. They had grown up in the same broken home, both of them neglected, both of them fighting to survive. Jamal had promised to look after her, to protect her from the dangers of the world. But he hadn't been able to save her that day, and that loss had haunted him ever since. He remembered it like it was yesterday, the afternoon when his sister had grabbed the bottle, thinking it was something harmless. Jamal had been out on the streets looking for food when he got the call. By the time he made it back to their rundown apartment, it was too late. His sister was already gone. He had watched as she slowly faded away, her body succumbing to the poison in the bottle she had mistaken for something else. It wasn't just the pain of losing her that haunted Jamal, it was the feeling of helplessness. He had failed her. He hadn't been there when she needed him the most. And now, standing in the park, watching the children play with a dangerous chemical, the memory of Mia flooded back, and he couldn't stand the thought of another child going through the same thing. Jamal clenched his fists, the weight of the past pressing down on him. He wanted to scream at the world to make them see the truth, to make them understand the pain he had lived with for so long. But instead, he stood silently, waiting. He had no control over the situation anymore. All he could do was hope that the people around him would see what he saw, that the balloon wasn't just a harmless toy, but a deadly danger that needed to be stopped. The minutes felt like hours as the security guards examined the balloon, their movements slow and deliberate. Jamal's gaze never wavered from the children, his eyes locked on the balloon with the chemical container. The child holding it was still unaware of the danger, laughing and running with the other kids. Jamal couldn't help but feel a pang of anger. How could anyone be so careless with something so dangerous? It was like the world didn't care, like it was blind to the risks people faced every day. Finally, one of the security guards called out to Theodore. "Sir, this balloon, it's attached to a chemical container. We need to remove it immediately." Theodore's face, which had been calm just moments ago, now looked pale with shock. Jamal could see the change in him, the billionaire's confidence shattered by the reality of what was happening. For the first time, Theodore seemed to be questioning everything. The truth that Jamal had tried to warn them about was becoming undeniable. The balloon wasn't just a toy, it was a potential threat. And it was only because Jamal had spoken up that the children hadn't been exposed to whatever toxic substance was inside. Jamal felt a strange mix of relief and anger wash over him. Relief that he had been right, that he had saved the children, but anger that it had taken a homeless boy shouting in the park for anyone to take notice. People like Theodore, people with power and money, didn't pay attention to the struggles of people like Jamal. They lived in a world of privilege, a world where problems could be solved with a check, a world where the voices of the poor were drowned out by the noise of wealth and influence. But now it was clear that Jamal's warning had mattered. It had saved lives. The children, still unaware of the danger they had been in, were led away from the fountain by their parents, who had been too stunned to react earlier. Theodore, his mind racing, finally turned to Jamal. He was still trying to process what had just happened. The boy, the homeless kid, had been right. Jamal had seen something no one else had noticed, and in doing so, he had prevented a disaster. Theodore's face was a mix of disbelief and admiration. He had met many people in his life, from world leaders to celebrities, but never had he encountered someone like Jamal. Are you sure this is poison?" Theodore asked, his voice shaking slightly. He was a man who had built his empire on trust, on knowing when to act, and yet here he was, questioning the reality of a situation that had caught him completely off guard. Jamal nodded slowly. He could see the doubt in Theodore's eyes, but there was nothing more he could say. He had already done his part. For a moment, there was silence between them. Jamal could feel the weight of the billionaire's gaze on him, studying him as if trying to figure out who this boy was and what had brought him here. It wasn't every day that a homeless kid had the chance to change the course of a wealthy man's day, and Theodore didn't know how to react. He was used to being in control, used to making decisions that affected the world around him. But this situation had been beyond his control, and for once he didn't know what to do. Jamal stood tall, his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving Theodore's. He wasn't looking for a reward, he wasn't looking for anything in return. All he wanted was for anyone, to recognize the pain he had gone through and understand why he had reacted the way he did. He wasn't just some random homeless kid yelling for attention. He had a reason, a painful reason, for everything he did. Theodore took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. "I'll make sure this is taken care of," he said, his voice steadier now. "Thank you for speaking up." It was a simple acknowledgement, but for Jamal it was enough. Theodore's words didn't change his life, but they did something even more important. They made him feel seen for the first time in a long while. Someone had noticed him, someone with power, someone who didn't just dismiss him as invisible. But even as Theodore offered his thanks, Jamal didn't feel like celebrating. He didn't feel like he had won. The victory in his eyes was hollow. It wasn't enough to stop what had happened to his sister. It wasn't enough to undo the years of pain and hardship. But maybe, just maybe, it was a step in the right direction. As Theodore walked away, giving instructions to his team, Jamal remained where he was, his eyes following the billionaire's every move. There was something different about the way Theodore held himself now, something that wasn't there before. Jamal wasn't sure what it was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, this strange moment in the park, had changed both of their lives forever. Jamal stood in the park, still processing everything that had just happened. The moment seemed to stretch out, like a dream that hadn't quite ended. It was hard to believe that he had actually done something to make a difference. A homeless boy, someone the world had long ago forgotten, had saved the lives of children. And now the most powerful man in the park, Theodore Donovan, was standing just a few feet away from him, his team of security guards rushing to make sure everything was under control. Jamal didn't know what to feel. Part of him was relieved that the children had been spared, but another part of him was frustrated. Frustrated that it had taken a stranger to shout in the middle of a park for anyone to notice something that should have been obvious. Why did it always feel like the world only listened when someone with power said something? He had been shouting for years, invisible to everyone around him. But today, for some reason, the right person had heard his cry for help. The tension in the air was thick. Theodore Donovan, the man who could buy anything he wanted, who controlled vast sums of money, was now standing still, lost in thought. Jamal could see the change in him. The billionaire's usual confidence had been replaced by something else. Was it guilt? Fear? Or maybe a mixture of both? Jamal had no way of knowing, but he could feel the weight of Theodore's gaze on him. The man had seen something in Jamal, something that was hard to ignore. The security team continued to examine the balloon, confirming that the chemical container attached to it was indeed dangerous. The children, now safe, were ushered away by their parents, who seemed completely unaware of the risk they had been in. The parents didn't even look at Jamal as they walked by, their faces filled with concern for their children, but not a single word of gratitude for the boy who had saved them. It didn't matter, Jamal thought. He hadn't done it for thanks. He had done it because someone had too. The atmosphere in the park slowly began to return to normal. People were going back to their conversations, the noise of the city creeping back into the background. But for Jamal, everything felt different. He could still hear the voices of the rich, the whispers of people who had never known struggle, who would never understand what it felt like to be invisible. It was hard not to feel like he was still out of place, like he was still just a shadow among them. But this time, something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just a boy in the background anymore. He had made an impact. Theodore, still lost in thought, finally turned to Jamal. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "You saw something that none of us did." His words were simple, but they carried weight. For the first time in Jamal's life, someone with real power was acknowledging him, not just as a homeless kid on the street, but as someone who had made a difference. Jamal had always been used to being ignored, dismissed, forgotten. But now, for the first time, he felt like maybe he mattered. Maybe he had something to offer. Jamal didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to shout, to ask why it had taken so long for anyone to notice him, but instead he just nodded. "I've seen a lot," he said softly. It wasn't much, but it was the truth. Jamal had seen things that most people couldn't even imagine. He had lived through things that had shaped him into who he was today, and he wasn't afraid to speak up when he knew something was wrong. Theodore seemed to understand. He took a step closer to Jamal, his eyes serious. "You have a good eye, you're smart. You could do more than just survive on the streets." Jamal felt a flicker of hope at Theodore's words. He had heard compliments before, but this felt different. It felt real. Jamal had never thought of himself as smart, not in the way that people like Theodore were. But maybe he was in his own way. He had learned to read people, to understand danger, to survive. Maybe that was a kind of intelligence, too. "I can help you," Theodore continued. "I'm sure there's more you want in life. More than just this." He motioned to the park, to the people walking by, to the life Jamal had been trapped in for so long. "You have potential, Jamal. I want to help you realize it." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He had heard these kinds of offers before, promises from people who wanted to help, but never really understood what it took. He had learned not to trust offers that came too easily. People who lived in wealth and comfort didn't understand the weight of survival. They didn't understand the struggle that came with living on the streets, but this was different. Jamal could see it in Theodore's eyes. There was no arrogance there, no superiority, just a genuine desire to help. "Why would you want to help me?" Jamal asked, his voice filled with suspicion. "I'm just a kid off the streets. What do you want from me?" Theodore paused for a moment, then answered simply, "Because you're the one who saw the danger. You saved those children. You're the reason they're safe right now. You're not just some homeless kid. You're someone who can make a difference." Jamal wasn't sure what to think. His mind was racing, his heart torn between the part of him that wanted to trust this man and the part of him that was too used to being disappointed. He had never been offered a chance like this before. People like him didn't get chances. People like him didn't get pulled out of the cycle of poverty, didn't get to escape the streets and live a better life. But maybe, just maybe, this was different. Jamal stood there for a long moment, weighing his options. He had spent his entire life surviving on his own, relying on no one but himself. Could he really trust this man? Could he trust someone who had everything and yet still seemed willing to help someone like him? Finally, Jamal spoke, his voice quiet but filled with determination. "I don't need your charity. I'm not some project for you to fix, but I'll take your offer." He didn't know exactly what that meant, but something told him that this could be the beginning of something important. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, Jamal felt like he might actually have a chance to shape it. Theodore nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "It's not charity," he said. "It's a partnership. You have the ability to change things, Jamal. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jamal didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. The words felt too big, too heavy to fit into his mouth. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, his life could be more than just surviving. Maybe it could be something more. As Theodore turned to leave, he paused and looked back at Jamal. "We'll talk more soon," he said. "Take care of yourself, Jamal." Then he walked away, leaving Jamal standing alone in the park. Jamal watched him go, his heart still racing, his mind spinning. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he was willing to find out. Jamal stood still for a long moment, watching as Theodore walked away. His mind was still spinning with the words that had just been spoken. A partnership. He'd never imagined someone like Theodore Donovan, a man with so much wealth and power, would offer anything like that to someone like him. And yet there it was. The offer was real. The chance to change, to escape the life he had known for so long. He felt a mix of emotions flood over him. On one hand, there was a spark of hope, something that had long been buried deep within him. On the other hand, Jamal couldn't help but feel the weight of disbelief. Was it possible? Could someone really help him? Or was this just another empty promise, something that would fade away once Theodore got what he wanted? Jamal had learned the hard way that people like him didn't get help from people like Theodore. The world didn't care about the homeless, the forgotten children who lived on the streets. All Jamal had ever known was the cold bite of rejection, the harsh reality of living without a home or anyone to trust. But there was something different about this moment. Jamal could feel it in the air. The way Theodore had looked at him, the way his words had carried meaning, it was different from all the others who had brushed him aside. Still, Jamal was cautious. He had no reason to believe that Theodore's offer was anything but an attempt to ease his own conscience. After all, men like him could fix anything with money, but Jamal knew that wasn't what he needed. He needed something more than that. He needed real change, something that would help him escape the cycle of poverty and hardship that had been his entire life. As the days passed, Jamal couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. Theodore's words echoed in his mind. "You have potential. You could do more than just survive." Those words lingered like a promise, one that Jamal wasn't sure he could trust but couldn't help but hope was true. Jamal spent the next few days walking around the city, trying to process everything that had happened. The usual sights, the cold, unfeeling buildings, the rush of people who didn't even see him, felt different now. He could still hear the sounds of the city, but it all seemed quieter, almost distant. He couldn't stop thinking about the opportunity that had been given to him. Was this the chance he had been waiting for, or was it just another disappointment waiting to happen? He passed by the park where everything had started, the place where he had yelled out, "Stop! It's poison!" It felt like a lifetime ago, even though it had only been a few days. Jamal's feet stopped in front of the fountain, the same place where he had seen the children playing with the dangerous balloon. He looked around, remembering how everything had come to a sudden halt when he had shouted out, how Theodore had looked at him with confusion, then with respect. He could still see the faces of the parents, still remember how they had looked at him like he was nothing, like he didn't belong. But something had changed since that moment. Jamal had saved those children. He had stopped a tragedy from happening, and in doing so, he had gained something more valuable than any possession: respect. It wasn't something he had ever expected to earn. In the world he lived in, respect was something that came only to the powerful, to those who had money, who had influence. But for the first time in his life, Jamal had been seen for who he was, not just a homeless boy, not just someone to be ignored. And that made all the difference. Jamal's thoughts were interrupted when he saw a familiar figure approaching. It was Theodore. Jamal hadn't expected to see him so soon. The billionaire was walking toward him, his usual confident stride somewhat more deliberate, as if he was unsure of how to approach the boy he had spoken to only days before. "Jamal," Theodore said when he reached him, offering a small but genuine smile. "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I want to make sure we follow through on what we talked about." Jamal raised an eyebrow, his suspicion still lingering. Follow through, he repeated, his voice cautious. What does that mean exactly? I want to offer you a place to stay, Theodore began. A job, an opportunity to get off the streets. I know you've had a tough life, but I believe you can do more than just survive. I've seen something in you that tells me you have the potential to do great things. But you need the chance to make it happen. Jamal felt his heart beat faster as he processed the words. A place to stay, a job, it all sounded too good to be true. Theodore didn't understand what it was like to survive on the streets, to live every day with nothing, to have to fight for every meal. Could he really just leave that behind? Could he trust Theodore enough to take the first step into a world he had never imagined? But Jamal knew that he had to make a choice. He could continue living the way he always had, scraping by, never knowing where his next meal would come from, always looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next setback. Or he could take a chance, risk everything for the chance at a better life. He had nothing to lose, and maybe, just maybe, this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. I don't know, Jamal said, his voice quiet but determined. I've never had anything handed to me. I've had to work for everything. I don't know if I can trust you. People like you don't know what it's like to live like I have. Theodore nodded, understanding the hesitation in Jamal's voice. I get it, he said. I can't pretend to know what it's like. But I'm offering you something real. I want you to have a future, not just a day-to-day survival. I want to help you build something that will last. Jamal stood there for a long moment, the decision weighing heavily on him. It wasn't an easy choice. Trusting someone who had so much, and yet had never experienced the hardships he had faced, felt like a risk he wasn't sure he was ready to take. But in the end, Jamal knew that if he didn't take this chance, he would always wonder what might have been. I'll give it a try, Jamal finally said, his voice steady, but only because I want something better. I want to change. Theodore smiled, the warmth in his expression making Jamal feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to take the first step toward a future that was still uncertain, but now just maybe a little brighter. Great, Theodore said, shaking Jamal's hand. Let's get started. Jamal walked away with Theodore, his mind still racing, but this time the feeling was different. For the first time in his life, he was taking a step forward, not into the darkness, but into something new, something real. And it felt like the beginning of something that could change everything. Jamal couldn't believe what had just happened. It felt like a dream, like he was living someone else's life. Just a few days ago, he had been roaming the streets, scavenging for food, and now here he was, walking beside one of the wealthiest men in the city, heading toward a future he had never imagined. As they walked, Jamal couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and fear. Theodore Donovan had promised him a job, a place to stay, and a chance at a better life. But it was hard for Jamal to truly believe it. He had always relied on himself, had learned to trust no one. The streets had taught him that lesson well. People didn't offer help without expecting something in return, and Jamal had learned not to trust offers that seemed too good to be true. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the way Theodore had spoken to him, not like a charity case or someone to be pitied, but like an equal, someone worth investing in. Maybe it was the way he had looked at Jamal when he had saved the children in the park. There had been something genuine in Theodore's eyes, something that made Jamal think this offer might be real. Still, Jamal wasn't ready to let his guard down. He had been let down too many times before. He wasn't about to make the same mistake again. So what's this job? Jamal asked, his voice cautious but curious. He hadn't asked before, too caught up in the whirlwind of the moment. But now, as they walked through the bustling streets of the city, he needed to know more. What kind of job was Theodore offering him? Was it something he could actually do, or was it just another false hope? Theodore smiled, his gaze focused ahead. It's a job in one of my companies. I own a few businesses, and we're starting a new project that I think you'd be perfect for. Jamal raised an eyebrow. A business? I don't know anything about running a business. Theodore laughed softly, as if he had expected Jamal's reaction. You don't need to know how to run a business. What you need is the drive to succeed, the willingness to learn, and I can teach you the rest. I've got a team of people who will help guide you, but what you bring is something that no one else can teach. Your instincts, your ability to see things other people don't. Jamal was silent for a moment, trying to process what Theodore had said. It sounded too good to be true. He had spent his whole life on the streets, never once imagining he'd find himself working for a man like Theodore. But what if it was real? What if this was his chance to turn his life around? I'm not going to promise you that it'll be easy, Theodore continued, as if reading Jamal's mind. Starting over is never easy, but if you're willing to put in the work, I think you can do something great. Jamal nodded slowly, still unsure of what he was getting himself into. But the offer was there, and for the first time in his life he had a chance, a real chance. He couldn't just walk away from it, not now, not after everything he had been through. They arrived at Theodore's office building, a towering skyscraper that seemed to touch the clouds. It was everything Jamal had imagined a billionaire's workplace would be: sleek, modern, and intimidating. The doorman greeted them as they entered, and Jamal couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as they stepped into the lobby. It was like walking into a different world, one that had always seemed out of reach for someone like him. The elevator ride to the top floor felt surreal. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to wake up from this dream, that any second now, someone would tell him he didn't belong here. But when the elevator doors opened, and they stepped out into a vast, open office space, Jamal's anxiety melted away. He could feel the energy in the room, people working, collaborating, and creating something bigger than themselves. "This is where the magic happens," Theodore said, his voice filled with pride as he looked around. "We've got teams working on everything from tech to sustainability, and I think there's a place for you in all of this." Jamal looked around, his mind racing. This was it. This was the opportunity he had dreamed of, not just a job, but a chance to build something, to create something of his own. He had always been a survivor, always relied on his own instincts to get by. Now, he had the chance to use those instincts in a whole new way. As they walked through the office, Theodore introduced Jamal to a few of his team members. They were kind, welcoming, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know Jamal. It was a stark contrast to the way people had treated him on the streets. They didn't look at him like he was a problem to be solved. They looked at him like he was someone who could contribute, someone who had potential. Jamal felt a small flicker of hope ignite within him. Maybe this was real. Maybe this was his chance. Later that day, Theodore took Jamal to a small office in the corner of the building, one that was far more modest than the rest of the space. It was clear that this was where Jamal would begin his journey. "This is where you'll start," Theodore said, motioning to the desk and computer set up in front of him. "I'll get you the training you need and we'll start small, but I want you to think big, don't limit yourself. The world is yours to take." Jamal sat down at the desk, feeling the weight of Theodore's words sink in. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. It was his chance to prove himself, to show that he was more than just a kid who had grown up on the streets. He wasn't just a homeless boy anymore. He was someone with a future. Over the next few weeks, Jamal threw himself into his work. He learned fast, picking up skills he never thought he'd need. Theodore's team helped him every step of the way, teaching him about the business world, about tech, about what it took to build something from the ground up. Jamal had never imagined he'd be interested in these things, but the more he learned, the more he realized how much potential he had. It was like a whole new world had opened up to him, one that he had never known existed. But even with all the new knowledge, Jamal couldn't forget where he came from. He still remembered the streets, still remembered the feeling of hunger, of fear. And he knew that there were others out there, other kids who didn't have the same opportunity he had been given. He promised himself that he would do whatever he could to help them, to give them a chance, just like he had been given. One afternoon, as Jamal sat in his small office, working through some new training material, Theodore walked in. He smiled when he saw Jamal, a sense of pride in his eyes. "You're doing great, Jamal," he said. "I knew you had it in you." Jamal looked up, his face lighting up with a smile. "Thanks," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you." Theodore nodded. "You've done all the hard work. I'm just here to help you get started. The rest is up to you." Jamal's heart swelled with pride. He had come so far from the streets, and it felt like he was finally on the path to something real. He didn't know exactly where it would lead, but he was ready for whatever came next. He had a job, a place to stay, and a chance to build something meaningful. And for the first time in his life, he knew that the future was his to create. Months passed, and Jamal's life slowly began to change in ways he had never imagined. He had spent so many years simply surviving, drifting from day to day without much hope for the future. But now everything felt different. He was no longer just a homeless boy on the streets. He had a job, a place to live, and a future that for the first time seemed possible. Every day, Jamal worked hard at the office, learning new skills, taking on more responsibility, and doing everything he could to prove that Theodore's faith in him wasn't misplaced. The company, which Theodore had introduced him to, was working on some exciting projects in the tech and sustainability sectors. Jamal didn't know much about those things at first, but he had always been good at picking things up quickly. The more he learned, the more fascinated he became. It felt like a whole new world, one that he had never known existed. Every task, every challenge was an opportunity to grow, and he embraced it with everything he had. The team at the office was incredibly supportive. They didn't treat him like a charity case, and they didn't treat him like he was beneath them. They treated him like an equal, like someone who had the potential to contribute in meaningful ways. For someone who had spent his entire life being overlooked and dismissed, that was a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. It made him want to work even harder. But even as Jamal's work life flourished, the memories of his past never completely faded. They were always there, lurking in the background, reminding him of where he had come from. He couldn't forget the hunger, the cold nights, the feeling of being invisible to the world. The streets had shaped him, had made him who he was. And no matter how much he changed, no matter how far he moved from his past, he knew that those experiences would always be a part of him. At night, after a long day at the office, Jamal would often find himself standing at his window, looking out over the city. The lights twinkling below seemed so far away, like a world he had never belonged to. But now, it felt more within his reach. The world that had once seemed so distant and unreachable now felt like a place he could be a part of. One evening, as Jamal stood at the window, Theodore called him. Jamal answered the phone, and Theodore's voice came through with a warm, reassuring tone. "Jamal, I've been meaning to talk to you," Theodore said. "I know you've been working hard, and I wanted to check in." "How's everything going?" Jamal smiled to himself. It felt good to be asked. It felt like someone cared, truly cared. "It's going well," Jamal replied. "I'm learning a lot. Every day feels like a new challenge, but I'm getting the hang of things." "I'm glad to hear that," Theodore said. "You've been doing an incredible job, Jamal. I see a lot of potential in you. I'm proud of what you've accomplished so far." Jamal felt a warmth spread through him at Theodore's words. It was the kind of praise he had never received before. It wasn't empty flattery, it was genuine. For the first time, Jamal realized that someone believed in him, really believed in him. "I appreciate that," Jamal said, his voice sincere. "I'm just trying to keep up and learn as much as I can." "You're doing more than keeping up," Theodore said. "You're excelling, and I want to offer you something else, a bigger role within the company. We're starting a new initiative, and I want you to be a part of it. I think you could lead it." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. "Lead it?" he repeated, not sure if he had heard correctly. "You mean you want me to be in charge of something?" Theodore laughed softly. "Yes, I do. You've shown the kind of leadership that can't be taught. It comes from your experiences, from the way you see the world. I think it's time for you to take on a bigger challenge. This is an opportunity for you to grow even more, and I believe you're ready." Jamal didn't know what to say. His mind was racing. He had never thought of himself as a leader, not in the way Theodore was talking about. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe this was what he had been waiting for. Maybe all those years on the streets, all the hardship, had prepared him for something bigger, something more meaningful. And now, here was an opportunity to prove it. "I don't know what to say," Jamal finally said, his voice filled with awe. "I never imagined I'd be in a position like this." "You've earned it," Theodore said. "You've worked hard, you've shown you're capable, and you've got a vision that's worth following." "I think you're ready." Jamal took a deep breath. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for, the moment that could change everything. It was a chance to prove not just to Theodore, but to himself, that he could make something of his life. He wasn't just a kid from the streets anymore. He was someone with potential, someone with the ability to lead, to make a difference. "I'll do it," Jamal said, his voice steady. "I'm ready." Theodore's voice was filled with pride. "I knew you would be." "I'm looking forward to seeing what you do with this, Jamal. You've got everything it takes." As they hung up the phone, Jamal sat down at his desk, his heart racing. This was the moment that could change everything. He had been given a chance, a real chance, to build something, to lead something, to make a difference. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was his future, his life, and he was going to make the most of it. The next few months were a whirlwind of meetings, projects, and decisions. Jamal was learning how to manage people, how to organize his thoughts, and how to make decisions that would affect the future of the company. It wasn't easy, but he thrived in the challenge. Every step forward felt like a victory. Every new skill he learned made him feel more confident. He had come so far from the boy who had once wandered the streets, not knowing where his next meal would come from. Now he was making decisions that could change lives, including his own. Through it all, Theodore remained a constant support. He didn't just offer Jamal a chance at a job. He offered him guidance, mentorship, and a belief in his potential that Jamal had never experienced before. With Theodore's help, Jamal was growing in ways he had never imagined. He was becoming the man he had always wanted to be, someone who could stand tall and proud, knowing that he had earned his place. But even as Jamal's life continued to change, he never forgot where he came from. He remembered the streets, the nights spent alone, the feeling of being invisible. And he promised himself that he would use his success to help others, to make sure no one else had to go through what he had. One evening, as Jamal looked out over the city once again, he realized something. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. He was making a difference, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged.